Hi everyone. Today we're going to talk about variables, hypotheses, and propositions. As you know from having read Chapter 5, variable is basically a noun that stands for variation within a class or category of objects, and those objects can be tangible. For example, how much money you have in your purse or wallet or in your pockets, or they can be intangible. For example, the motivation to do well in this course. Constant is a characteristic that doesn't vary within a group of objects. A constant for you in this class would be that you're all graduate students. And researchers choose specific variables to study when they think that there could be a relationship that they want to explore between or among them. This next slide is going to show one way of looking at variables, either as quantitative or categorical. Quantitative variables are thought of as having distinct categories and can be divided into smaller units. A categorical variable, on the other hand, does not vary in degree, amount, or quantity, but varies differently and qualitatively. So an example of a quantitative variable would be reading speed. An example of a categorical variable would be political party. Another way to look at variables is by referring to them as independent or dependent. As you know, an independent variable is what the researcher manipulates and is the presumed or possible cause. So the researcher examines it to see if it produces an effect, and the dependent variable is the presumed result. So the dependent variable is what is being influenced or affected by the independent variable. Independent variables can either be manipulated or selected. If manipulated, then the researcher creates a study and changes conditions and refers to this as the experimental or treatment variable. This slide shows the relationship between independent and dependent variables. Again, the independent variable is the presumed or possible cause, and the dependent is the presumed result or outcome. And the relationship is typically one in which the researcher manipulates the independent variable to see the effect that it has, or the presumed effect it has, on the dependent variable. In this slide, we see an experimental study that has been carried out. And let's say that the question that the researcher is examining is whether lecture or discussion is a better way of teaching research methods. So in the first bar, you see lecture, and in the second, you see discussion. The first bar represents a class in which the professor is lectured exclusively. And in the second case, the professor has opted to use a more student-centered approach by using discussion much more frequently. At the end of the semester, the professor, who is also the researcher, administers a 100-point multiple choice exam, and it looks like the discussion group, the discussion section, has outperformed quite significantly the lecture group on this end of year or end of semester exam. So in this case, the independent variable, which is being manipulated, is the method of instruction, lecture versus discussion. That's plotted on the x-axis. And then on the y-axis, test scores, which is quantitative, has been plotted or charted. So you can see that there's a big difference in test scores between discussion and lecture, even though that is not explicitly stated. Other types of variables include extraneous variables, which are independent variables that haven't been controlled, and they can be alternative explanations if they are not identified and held constant. In this slide, we see examples of extraneous variables. The situation is that a principal of a high school compares the final exam scores of two history classes taught by teachers using different methods. But in the course of the experiment, there are many other ways or possible explanations for the results. And these are considered extraneous variables. For example, the size of the class, the gender of students, the gender of teacher, the age of teacher, time of day the class meets, days of the week the class meets, ethnicity of the teacher, and length of class. These are all alternative explanations potentially for the outcomes. And if you look more closely at the description of the classes, it's possible that these extraneous variables could explain the outcomes of the experiment. So hypothesis is a prediction about the possible outcome of a study. And there are clear advantages of stating a hypothesis. It forces us to think more deeply about possible outcomes of the study. It enables us to make specific predictions based on prior evidence or theoretical arguments. And it helps to clarify whether we are or aren't investigating a relationship. So in this case, I'm talking explicitly about experimental research and the expectation that a hypothesis be stated at the start of the experiment. Disadvantages of stating hypotheses include potential to lead to a bias on the part of the researcher. Some studies, it would be presumptuous to predict what findings would be. And then focusing on the hypothesis exclusively could prevent the researcher from seeing other phenomena that might be important to the study. As you know, directional is preferred to non-directional, and that a directional hypothesis is one in which the researcher indicates the specific direction that he or she expects will emerge in the relationship of the study. And that direction is usually based from the researcher having looked at the literature. The direction can also come from personal or professional experiences or from others, usually experts. A non-directional hypothesis is when there's no specific prediction. Sometimes it's difficult to make predictions, so it would not be appropriate to state that. So I'll let you look at this slide, but it shows many different hypotheses coming from a single research question regarding why it is that test scores are falling in this particular school. Now, as I mentioned earlier, in experimental studies, the expectation is that the researcher will state a hypothesis or a set of hypotheses prior to the start of the study. This is also true of other quantitative research designs, specifically correlational research studies, survey research studies, and also typically causal comparative studies. So the idea that the researcher is going to predict the outcome of this study even before the study begins. Now, in qualitative research, that would not be appropriate because qualitative tends to be more exploratory. As we'll talk about next week or next time, qualitative research is the other large paradigm in doing social science research. Quantitative traditions or the quantitative paradigm that we've talked about includes research types such as experimental research, correlational, causal comparative, and survey research. So next week we'll start talking more about qualitative research and the different approach that qualitative researchers take. In general, the process tends to be much more open and exploratory and flexible. So stating a hypothesis would not be appropriate. But in lieu of that, I am a strong proponent of stating propositions. A proposition is really a tentative or mini hypothesis. It's a flexible tool. And propositions can come from the literature or personal, experiential, or professional knowledge. Ultimately, propositions are supposed to be flexible tools that can help focus and guide data collection. So proposition is not a hypothesis that's restated as a qualitative proposition. A proposition is a statement of a potential direction that you could use. So I want to use an example from an actual study that was conducted in the doctoral program, in the EDD program at SF State. And the qualitative dissertation looked at how first-generation students of color negotiate academic and social challenges in four-year colleges. So in this particular case, the researcher, the student, stated the proposition that first-generation students of color seek and create counter spaces or third spaces that sustain their motivation for college. And that comes from theoretical work from a sociologist named Baba, and the work that he has done on suggesting that there are alternative spaces, first being home, the second being school, and third being sort of a counter space that students sometimes seek as they try to persist in higher education. So this is one direction that the qualitative researcher used, but ultimately it didn't pan out. It turns out that this was not consistent with the interview data that she was collecting. So as a result, she went in a slightly different way that looked more at transformational resistance theory, which is another theory that comes from the literature as well. So I just want to conclude by saying that if you're doing a quantitative study, i.e. an experiment, a survey study, or causal comparative or correlational study, the expectation is that you will state a hypothesis or two. In qualitative research, that would be inappropriate. So there's no expectation for you to state a hypothesis. But in lieu of that, I would like you to state a proposition, which is a tentative or watered down hypothesis that is more restated as kind of a direction that will help your data collection. There are some qualitative researchers that would never state a proposition because they believe that it might negatively affect how they perceive or receive information in the course of their data collection. But I'm very much a pragmatist, and I believe that theoretical propositions or propositions guiding research studies, such as qualitative ones, can be very helpful.